And we are recording. Adam, welcome to the Honey Badger Diaries.
Hi, Aaron. So I saw one of your other Honey Badger Diaries. So thanks
Which
for
one did you
inviting me
see?
on. Samson's. I saw it come across his timeline.
Right. Just before we started recording, I was messing with my mic. I couldn't get it on, and you told me that I didn't need to rush. You were messing around on Twitter with the memes. Can I just say, aren't the memes, like the whole situation is dramatic all across the world, and the economic situation, a lot going on, but the memes are the best they've ever been, or not?
Yeah, I mean, it feels kind of like the Bitcoin cycle has gone from, 5 days a week, 12 hours a day to 7 days a week. I don't know, like more like 16 hours a day or something. Like people are stuck at home, so messing around online is something they're prone to do. So it seemed like the news cycle got more.
Yes. Yeah. Every day feels like it's too short for me, even though I don't have that much to do. What do you think of the Brr meme?
That's a pretty nice meme. Yeah, the money printer. I watched something that Max Kaiser did on Kitco recently. Kitco is a gold. I think it's a company actually, but they have a kind of video interview series mostly about gold. But they had Max Kaiser on talking about Bitcoin and the economy generally and stuff. That was pretty interesting. And he did the Burr meme on that and something else recently. I think Stacy was doing it.
I saw Stacy do it as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I usually start my podcasts by sort of giving a short recap of what's been happening in the country of the person I'm speaking with. You're in Malta?
Yeah.
What has been happening? I don't want to dwell on this because, especially for European countries, it's all sort of similar. So we can sort of rush through it a little bit. But what has been happening in Malta recently?
Well, I mean, it's a small country, so the statistics are more human numbers. Like it's hard to, wrap your head around percentages when you live in a country with, 30, 60, 70 million people. And there are tens of thousands of people, or even 100,000. I saw some statistics in a few countries. So in Malta, the population is about 450,000. And last I saw, 370 people were infected, and I don't know, probably about 10 or 15 times that have been tested and found not to be infected so far. And as of yesterday, 3 people died, and I think they were all sort of older people with other health risks, I should say. One of them was a 92-year-old guy and so on. But, it's a trailing indicator. So there are, more people in hospital. I'm not sure the exact numbers. They seem to be approaching it in some kind of hybrid between what Korea did and what other European countries did. So they seem to be acted more quickly in blocking, in initially people who would arrive in Malta, because it's a tourist destination. There's normally about 1 million tourists during a year's holiday season. And so they introduced it's a few weeks ago now, a 14-day quarantine on arrival for people, either for anybody, regardless of reason for arrival. So of course that promptly stopped the tourists.
Where do they
arriving.
Where do they quarantine? Is it home quarantine?
Home quarantine with spot checks. So they want you to take it seriously. The police will spot check people. I guess you have to fill in a form. I was already in Malta before they instituted this. So I didn't have it, but they have caught a few people who are not respecting their home quarantine, and there's a fine. And so that's one thing. And the other thing they've been doing is when they find people who call to medical services because they are suspect they have COVID, and they test them and find they have. Obviously, most of them are home quarantined, and I guess if they're ill enough, then they go into the hospitals. But they're also doing quite aggressive contact tracing. So they seem to have had good success at finding people who were connected with people who were ill and home quarantining them too. So I thought that might be improving the situation. Now, if you look at it percentage terms, the statistics are not that much different to other European countries, but I think that maybe the situation is a bit better. It's just that they have better testing, like more earlier testing. So they may be like less looking at a trailing indicator and more a leading indicator. But it's like very hard to tell because every country is reporting different things, different statistics. And I think the other thing people may not realize about Malta is it's it's a small country, but its healthcare is quite advanced. So the World Health Organization ranking for Malta for healthcare standard of delivery is higher than the US and the UK, for example. So they have very modern hospital. There's no ailment or serious, operation that you need that would cause them to fly you to another country. They can do everything in country. They have lots of highly qualified healthcare professionals. And actually, I think probably a higher density of healthcare professionals and hospital beds and equipment than most countries because it's there's a medical tourism trade. So there are private hospitals where people will pay to take elective surgeries, or because they were considering going private for something that's diagnosed and could be available publicly, but has a long waiting list and is cheaper in Malta because the cost base is lower.
Right.
So given that there's no tourism of any kind, there are multiple completely unused, modern private hospitals, and they have been talking about drafting or paying them to participate if needed. It doesn't seem like it's overloaded so far. But.
Right. You mentioned that a lot of countries are reporting different things, and that is definitely true. What is your general impression about the virus? How bad is it? There's some disagreements about that. Some people think it's overblown. Some, what's your best take?
Well, I think we don't know because, we don't know how many people have recovered and don't know they had it. And the claims for that vary between like 50 and 80%, which is a huge variance in different countries. And it seems like almost nowhere has serological tests, like to test for antibodies for people who have had disease and recovered. I heard that Germany is planning to start testing 1,000 people a day starting at the beginning next month. So presumably they have a serological testing that they're preparing.
I think the Netherlands has already started doing that.
So I think that would be a great piece of information to have. So I think the other thing that's interesting is there's somebody with some kind of epidemiology simulation experience posted a video of a simulation package, a SIR model, and they showed different parameters that they could adapt and what it did to the infection rate and the peak and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And they were able to simulate all kinds of things with it, sort of how effective contact tracing is and how much people are traveling around. If people go frequently to a central place, sort of emulating people going to a supermarket very frequently, and all kinds of parameters. And it seems like, to get an intuition for this, there are some exponential factors. So it seemed like many of the parameters they were changing, like pretty much it would lose control and go exponential regardless. But in that model, the 80% effective contact tracing has enormous effect. So I thought that was interesting, just for an intuition. Of course, it's just a simplified model, right? So who knows?
Sure.
Yeah, and I mean, there are puzzling things as well, like countries with high mortality rates that are advanced economies with advanced healthcare services, And
I think that
it's
probably has mostly to do with just not a lot of tests. Like in the Netherlands, mortality rate officially is like 10%, but that's just because they're not testing a lot of people. It's definitely not 10%.
right, reactive testing of people who are severely sick only or something.
Yeah.
But there are some other interesting, I mean, of course, none of this is, I mean, I have no like advanced medical qualifications. My medical qualifications stopped at age 16 actually, and did like physics and maths and things to 18 and then so on. But it seems like, I mean, everybody's reading to try and understand with various math or statistical expertise to digest the information. But it seems like that the data is just different, and there are also factors that there might be unknown factors, basically. So one thing I saw is like a speculative medical paper, so I don't know how seriously it could be taken, but suggesting that countries with tuberculosis vaccines have lower mortality risk and lower infection rates from respiratory diseases in general, which is curious because tuberculosis is a bacterial infection, but they do say that there are papers, not just recent papers, but papers indicating that it somehow improves the immune response to respiratory issues in general, not just bacterial ones. And so the UK, for example, until 2005, almost every person would have been vaccinated as a child. Not everybody, but enough. And so, and other countries don't do that. It just depends. Like they discontinued it in 2005 because the disease is like largely inoperative in the UK. There are countries which do have ongoing infection rates, like India has tuberculosis still. But I think it was just on a cost benefit basis. They decided, okay, we're spending so much per year to do this. There are more useful things to spend healthcare money on that give a better cost benefit, and so they discontinued it. But it's interesting if that is a material effect, and we don't know yet because we don't know if we can compare, for example, the UK statistics to Italy's statistics. It seemed like Italy was much more accurately reporting statistics. So if anybody died with comorbidity, so with some other issue, like a heart issue, they would still count that as a COVID-related death, where other countries would just say, oh, this person had a heart attack, and not count that. So of course that makes the statistics not really comparable. Plus they have an older population on average demographically. So
that's for sure. So the situation in Malta now is the country's in lockdown, more or less, right? Everything is closed.
Well, so I mean, they did some interesting things there too. So they closed non-essential shops, so shopping malls, clothing stores, but they kept essential shops open, obviously pharmacies, food stores, supermarkets, and takeout food, like deliveries and takeout food places, and some other things that are needed to sort of maintain things. But it doesn't seem like industry stopped. Like it doesn't seem like they shut down what you might call non-essential things.
Like what?
Fully, because like they are doing constructing apartment blocks, doing public works construction, like a new ferry terminal. I mean, they were working today on a Sunday, even with bigger
Sunday, even.
Yeah. So
in the most Catholic country of Europe.
Yeah. So I don't know. That seems like, but the people that were impacted by government, I don't know if it's a requirement or a strong suggestion, I'm not sure exactly the force behind it, but anyway, the non-essential retail shops that closed, the workers in those shops are being paid 800 euros a month, which is about €5 an hour, which I suspect is around the typical shop assistant pay. to compensate for involuntary loss of employment kind of thing. So they're covering that, and the cost of living in Malta is not so high, and there's no tax below 11,000 euros or thereabouts income, so that would be tax-free anyway. So that's good. The other interesting thing they did, which I think is like fairly unique, though I did hear maybe one other country did it, is they, again, I'm not sure of the degree of force behind this, but they recommended that people over 65, people with recent immune issues, so for example, somebody who had chemotherapy within 6 months, and there's a whole list of things, right? So somebody who'd had a severe lung infection, immune issues, currently pregnant, they had a list of things, right? And they said that those people should self-quarantine and have extended family members deliver food, or there were numbers they could call if they needed assistance. And so I thought that's interesting because firstly, people over 65 or with those medical issues are much more at risk, more to say that they keep the mortality down. And secondly, people over 65 are often not in employment. They're retired, let's say. And so if they go from being retired to continuing to be retired but not able to walk around outside, that's an inconvenience and an imposition, but it doesn't impact the economy, and the economy is also a factor in well-being. So I thought that was a clever trade-off, and they said initially that this would account for 25% of the population, because they also stipulated that it should include any other family members who live with somebody in this category, but they later relaxed that, I suspect because the public didn't take it too well. And so now, somebody who is working and lives at home with a parent, for example, who is in this situation, they are allowed to go out for work. So, and there were in Malta a lot of people. There's more kind of multi-generational households than is typical in other European countries. So that could be, that kind of policy would be more of an imposition in Malta than it might be in some other countries.
So it sounds like you think the policy in Malta right now is reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, Maltese have generally pretty smart policy-wise. I found, like, before this. Yeah.
How do you feel about so some Bitcoiners, for example, a lot of Bitcoiners, I think, including yourself, are libertarians or not exactly state-minded. So now the state is forcing some people to stay home. What do you think of that? Is it a good option, or what's your position there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do have the anti-authority kind of outlook on things in general. If somebody tells me to do something and acts as if they have an authority to do it, I'm going to question, well, why should you? Why do you? I reject your authority. A lot of authority is actually in people's minds. Like, there's a lot of bureaucracy. And if you actually question a bureaucrat as to, but why, it blows their mind, right? Because nobody ever questions the status quo. And some things are not actually mandatory that people just assume are, and you can just, ignore them or work around them if you choose, or there are alternative procedures to work around them. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's certainly an interesting situation for trade-offs because, I guess the argument would be that, if a large part of society ignores or chooses to flout the requests, then that can have impact for other people, potentially, right?
Sure, yeah.
So it's not just like a personal choice at that point. I mean, I think there's also some restriction. I mean, people are still walking around, though. I think there's a lot less people. I mean, firstly, there's a lot less people walking around in general because there are no tourists, so that helps. And I think people have a pretty good self-preservation meme in Malta. Genetically and like attitude, because you don't survive on a rocky island for 2,000 years without having your wits about you, basically. So, if people get the picture that there's some danger, they will avoid it. So I think I think people are generally paying attention, but they also have some requests that people not congregate in groups of larger than 3.
Mm-hmm.
And there are police walking around who will tell people to break it up if they're ignoring that. And
right.
I think I saw in one of the newspapers that some people have been fined €100 for not following that.
So I already mentioned that Malta. One last policy question before we get to economics. I already mentioned that Malta was the most religious country of Europe, or at least the most Catholic country of Europe. I noticed in one of the rules, I don't know if it's been lifted now, or this has been, I don't know if this has now also been restricted, but I saw a rule in Malta that there was an exception on the lockdown for essential religious services, which made me wonder, what is an essential religious service? Do you have any idea? It's Easter
No,
Sunday,
I don't know.
but I'm sure people aren't going to churches, right? These are closed?
No, I don't think so. But normally there's a lot of, there aren't really towns, but there are regions. So there are lots of regions, and some of them are like adjacent, so you can walk between them without realizing. But each region has its own like feast day or festivals, and they will, have processions and street stalls and bands and things. So it's pretty often that one region or another has something like this going on. And so I think there was some kind of photos in the paper of more social distancing, very much muted versions of that, right? So a few people walking very spaced out rather than a full-on procession, just to not completely overlook the holiday. Yeah, I mean, it is a quite Catholic country. I think and I'm not Catholic myself, but I think it's the second most important location in the Catholic kind of order beyond the Vatican.
Sure, yeah, the Vatican would be the most Catholic country of Europe. I forgot about that one.
But I mean, in terms of, there's some hierarchy within the church that I don't know the details of, but the highest ranking people in Malta on the religious sites are considered second in rank to the Vatican globally. So right. There are many countries that are quite Catholic, and obviously most countries with some Catholic presence. So it's a small country with a big Catholic significance, I guess.
So I've done a lot of digging in the cypherpunk archives. I don't know if I've ever read this quote back to you, or maybe I tweeted it at some point, I'm not sure. But I found this quote by 27-year-old Adam Beck, which was, "What we want is fully anonymous, ultra-low transaction cost, transferable units of exchange. If we get that going, the banks will become the obsolete dinosaurs they deserve to become." Were you into Austrian economics before Bitcoin, or what's your take on the economy? And
yeah, I mean, I wasn't really kind of into Austrian economics, but I was very interested in free market thinking and capitalism, and kind of one version of that is anarcho-capitalism, just meaning extremely free markets with very light or no government, minimal government, trending towards no government. So I think that if people have read the book Snow Crash, it's kind of a blueprint for the future. Sort of a zero remaining government. Oh wow!
I'm reading
okay.
it.
Good, yeah, that's a great book. One of my favorite books, basically. And yeah, so I mean, it took a while, but Bitcoin is here, and it's I think that Nick Szabo. So I was on a panel at a conference last year with Nick Szabo and David Chaum. The video's online now. It took a while till they released the video, and it seemed like we had different balance of interests. So I was interested in hard electronic cash, and it sounded like Nick Szabo was a little bit more interested in digital gold, hence BitGold, right? So sort of monetary reform, where I was more interested in, we're interested in related things, but his kind of input driver or thought process for electronic cash at the time he was proposing BitGold was monetary reform. Mm-hmm. And my line of thinking was, hard anonymous electronic cash, and Bitcoin has both of those things. And David Chaum was actually...
So just to be sure, with cash you mean anonymous as well then, right?
Yes.
That was your primary interest.
Right. Yeah. Because there was a lot of interest in privacy technology, internet browsing, anonymous communication, the ability to use smart contracts to contract anonymously online using pseudonyms and reputation and smart contracts and things like that. And for any of that stuff to be truly useful and go somewhere, we needed an electronic cash system. And so, at the time, so David Chaum's company, in the mid-90s, DigiCash, that form of electronic cash was a bit centralized, but it was also like fiat currency denominated. It had to operate in partnership with a bank. Mm-hmm. And so, actually the cypherpunks had a go at bootstrapping value into their demo server. So they said to run a server, they'd only issue 1 million units, and you could get a few by emailing them. So people just started selling things. I sold some t-shirts with illegal to export crypto implementation on them. And other people sold different things. And then unfortunately, DigiCash went bankrupt before that experiment bootstrapped. But, it looked like it was plausible. Anyway, so there was no monetary policy, right? Because it's just based on fiat currency. So I think, it's curious that the monetary reform, digital gold-like aspects of Bitcoin actually has probably amplified the adoption, because people get involved in something for different reasons. And an investment without a philosophy, just because it looks like other people are interested, is one reason people get involved. And just for the technology, bearer electronic cash or the functionality to be able to transact internationally with low friction, lots of reasons people get involved. And then once they get involved, they get enamored by the other properties of it and start to think about the monetary reform. And of course, the current kind of economic climate with huge quantitative easing.
Yeah, what do you make of that? What do you make of the current situation? What's your take?
Some people are thinking that this, it's like more than 2008, right? Which I already thought was pretty egregious. That, I was living in the UK still at that time, and was that right? Anyway, somewhere out, maybe it was somewhere else. But I was looking at the news, and the fact that the UK was bailing out banks, like the government was buying very badly run banks that took stupid risks, and the government bailed them out. And in the US, the government bailed out insurance and reinsurance companies and banks and let only a couple go bankrupt. And it's ludicrous, because you can just let them go bankrupt. It doesn't impact the customers. You just new shareholders come and buy the assets and continue the next day. You don't need to bail anything out. So people may have a better argument this time, because it didn't, we don't have the quantitative easing directly because of financial mismanagement. It's because of a black swan medical event. But
well, Nassim Taleb called it a white swan. He said it was entirely predictable.
Okay. Well, predictable that there are shocks.
A pandemic was predictable. It was inevitable that a pandemic would hit the globe
at some point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's not the first one, but it's had a wider global reach, I guess, and wasn't caught and curtailed aggressively enough early enough, and maybe is more contagious and just harder to contain for other reasons. But I mean, having said that, I think there were a lot of excesses in the way that companies were being run, creeping back up towards 2008 levels. So, the fact that some companies are now getting bailed out may be forgiving, extremely bad governance and financial management. For example, companies that were buying back their own stock to enrich, executive shareholders, basically, are now looking at bailouts. And the other thing is, if you do these bailouts, you create zombie companies, and once the economy starts recovering, people's spending habits will probably have changed. And so some of those companies may not need to exist anymore, or may only be viable if the debt is, if the debt burden is removed by the existing shareholders.
So you're against bailing out the airline companies, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably something that's going to be hit. I mean, the other factor is that, it looks like most of the money that's been printed is going to big companies and not to individuals.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what sure the statistic is, but it's, a small percentage, right? Probably under 5% or less. And, if you wanted to typify this as a forced extended holiday, right? So people take Christmas or a period off, and the economy doesn't disappear because people just, they go somewhere, they hang out with their family for a week, and then they go back on average. So, if you just paid people salaries and they did that, that would be one thing. But if you just print, like, what did the US print, like $24 trillion or something?
Who knows?
Pour most of it
Incredible
randomly
amounts
into companies. I mean,
and we don't know in which companies they're putting the money. I think that's discretionary. They only reveal that 6 months down the line. I heard something like this.
Yeah, I mean, they seem to have waived, the disclosure requirements for policy planning or something.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's permanent or temporary, but it's like a very bad thing. So, I think some people are rightly asking, if you can print money like that, why do you need to collect taxes? Another maybe interesting side effect is, effectively there is universal basic income in some places now. I mean, literally giving money to people, whether they're impacted on a personal basis or not. So,
do you support? Is that something you support? Is it something you find interesting?
I don't know. I mean, it seems that some countries could get there just because they have defective tax policies. So, for example, in the UK, they had enough let's say, tax rebates. So, and they kept, originally the idea was somebody who was on low income with children could get a cashable tax rebate, even though they were in employment, if their income was below a certain threshold. Mm-hmm. And then they had, a period of socialist government, and they increased the threshold until people earning, I think, like £50,000 a year, which is a pretty high income in UK spending patterns, are also receiving this. And so, effectively they're taxing people and then giving it back to them.
Right. And
for a big proportion of the population, so it's a kind of populist thing to do, because people don't add up 1 + 1 is 2, and they don't see that, the tax rates are higher than they need to be. Of course, the government loses probably 2/3 of it in the administration of this process, and it gives them their own money back. So that being the case, you might as well just rationalize that tax system and just give everybody, I don't know, £10,000 a year, and lay off, the 10% of the workforce that is administering nonsense like that, and literally be better off economically, and save all the administration. And then there's fraud as well, because people are trying to claim who are actually working or self-employed and so on. So, evaluating the so-called need invites fraud, has costs, and then when the government proportion of the workforce that is employed by government reaches 25%, which I think is approximately the case in the UK and probably in many other countries, then you've got to think that the other 33% of people's salary basically has to pay public. You need 33% tax just to pay people who are in the government, and a good portion of people in the government are not actually providing valuable services. They're actually making enterprise difficult. They create red tape and friction. So I think taxation reform would go a long way. And if you're going to have a social security system, then having just a cashable tax voucher that, if you pay tax, you can reduce your tax. If you don't pay tax, you don't have enough income, you can just cash it. If that's actually cheaper to do, which it seems like it would be in a few countries, then maybe. So I'm having interest in Switzerland as well. My mother is from Zurich, and so I watched the kind of English language Swiss news a bit, and they had a go at having a referendum for universal basic income a few years ago, and it didn't pass. I mean, Switzerland has fairly direct form of democracy, so that some thousands of people can put forward a bill to revoke or introduce regulation, and the government has to follow it if it passes. So it was a kind of citizen-led thing that enough people were interested to try and have a referendum that they had to procedurally have a referendum, and it didn't pass, and by fairly large margin. But there was like a considerable support, and I think they think that the reason it didn't pass is because there's a significant cost of living difference between the different cantons. So if you had, a fixed redeemable tax voucher kind of thing, it would create some other problems. Like people would, I don't know, rush to the lower cost cantons, or the tax voucher would be not enough to live on in the more expensive cantons. It would cause migration and upheaval or something. So it's like not an easy thing to normalize.
Right.
Anyway, I thought it was interesting that they tried. Switzerland is a very capitalist country. Probably, I think, often considered the most capitalist country in world economic rankings.
Right.
For many years. So it's very low unemployment, high disposable income, low taxation, quite efficient. So it has a kind of quite high average income on a purchasing power basis. So it's an interesting country to want to consider something like that. Like they could afford something like that probably. Of course, we don't know what it does to motivation. There may be some portion of people who would just cash it and play video games, or so maybe a side effect of the COVID lockdowns is there are people that decide that, hey, this is okay, I get paid and I can do the Ready Player One virtual reality thing from my pod and not have to go outside.
Yeah, well, there's been some research on it, and of course the research has its own issues because, for example, it's temporary or it's uncertain if it's temporary or not, these kinds of things. But there has been some research in towns in Canada and other places where they saw where they gave people basic income and studied how they reacted, and most people kept working. They didn't quit their job or anything.
That's interesting.
You mentioned earlier, we mentioned the bailouts and the money printing. What do you expect where's fiat currency going at this point? Do you expect inflation? Hyperinflation, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, well, I listened to a kind of investment outlook video from Raoul Pal, who's a quite well-known macro investor.
Yeah, from Real Vision.
Yeah, and he is not optimistic. I mean, he thinks that this is the end of for US currency as reserve currency, that hyperinflation is coming, that there will be a new, it's the end of the Bretton Woods era. There will have to be some new system of international money and value. So, and here's like some history of making significantly correct macro calls. So evidently there's a lot going on. I mean, I think he had sort of 60% confidence in some of this stuff. So he's not saying like, 100%, because investment is partly about calculating your odds and, weighting your bets kind of thing. But that's a lot of money that's being printed. And, when it unwinds, and also like we've got negative interest rates or zero interest rates in more places.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a whole new world. So we'll see.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting time for Bitcoin. I mean, that comes to the quantitative easing versus quantitative hardening discussion.
We're just going to ask about that. How's Bitcoin going to play into all of this?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, typically, of course, people know, Bitcoin people will tend to say, oh, fiat currency is terrible. It lost, even the strongest fiat currencies like the British pound. The Swiss franc is like long-term, does quite well versus other currencies because it has low inflation and good economics generally. But even the best ones like lose 99% of their value over a 100-year period. But that's not really the point, because people don't put savings in, fiat currency under a mattress over a long period of time. They invest it in things, right? They buy houses, their own house, or a rental, like a second rental house or an apartment that they rent out, or they do Airbnb, or they invest in stocks. And then there's investment theory about...
Or even it's just in a bank account with interest.
Right, yeah. And so it's not really accurate to compare that as the, Bitcoin versus fiat currency. Well, nobody really uses fiat currency as a savings instrument. But in today's environment, a lot of those things are looking uncertain, right? So the stock markets are significantly down, and nobody really knows whether they're going to drop the same again. So investing in stock markets, if you're not a professional investor and don't have a view about how to hedge and which sectors you think, form a thesis about which sectors should actually benefit, putting money into a stock index is looking like a dangerous thing to do, right? And buying real estate, I don't know, like there's a lot of rental properties that people are not paying rent on, and a lot of unemployed people who won't be paying mortgage payments. Buying real estate right now is not clear, and maybe with an increase in home working, big cities with overpriced real estate will see an exodus to, for like personal safety, to more remote regions. And so some of the excessive property prices may no longer be sustainable. So buying property is not looking too good, because like a savings account is a joke, right? I mean, like 0% negative interest, you can't get a return on that. And what else is left? Like government bonds, holding fiat currency. There's a lot of cash on the side because people, and that's why the dollar went up. People
Government
sold
bonds
everything.
Are negative as well, right? I think at least Dutch government bonds.
Yeah, I think so. I think the US as well, maybe. And which sounds illogical, but I think it's not quite, because if you got a lot, as a fund level, what are you going to do with the money? So in Switzerland, they've had negative interest rates for a while, so they actually have figured out what to do with it, which is they rent, even companies rent a bank deposit vault and put, millions of Swiss francs in 1,000 Swiss franc bundles in a bank vault to avoid. Yeah. So they have some, what is it? I think think 40 billion, anyway, quite a lot of 1,000 Swiss franc notes in cash because people, I guess they just have to keep making more as people withdraw them, right? So that's something people can do. But then you've got to look at like, well, what's coming next? They printed all this money, and the money is only chasing the same physical goods. So there has to be inflation midterm. And so holding just money is you're going to lose almost for sure, right? So you're looking into the abyss. There's nothing to do. And so when people say, well, buy gold, buy company bonds, I guess they're thinking that some companies won't default on the bonds, and maybe that's true for like some sectors, right? Or buy Bitcoin, and there's not much else that you would feel comfortable putting on. And so that's what Raoul Pal was saying, and what a number of people are saying. But I guess that for a big segment of society, Bitcoin is still a fringe thing that they don't understand or don't know about, and they're facing a lot of uncertainty too. So, they're going to hold on to the simplest, most intuitive thing, where maybe asset allocation of putting 5% into something that looks volatile and risky is actually a good thing to do because it has more upside. But that doesn't occur to a lot of people.
Right. Do you think Bitcoin is ready for prime time in that way? Like, if people would decide to go to Bitcoin, is Bitcoin ready for that? Is Bitcoin ready for mass adoption, even as a store of value?
Yeah, I mean, I think the right way to invest or hold Bitcoin varies depending on the person's technical capability. So, we might feel comfortable with the IT backup for keys and cold storage and fireproof things, but, not everybody's an IT proficient kind of person. So, but there are more ways to store and buy Bitcoin. I think just recently there's an ETF in Canada now, I3 fund. Yeah, it's just last week or something it finally got passed. So it's not a US one, but it's a Canadian one, and it finally got past the regulators. So that's pretty interesting. I don't think you can access that from the US. Like the cross availability of funds are different. So, there are ways for people to invest. I think sometimes funds are not allowed to invest, like pension funds, in something that is more esoteric, right? So a US ETF would help them because they would have a vehicle to do it. So, hedge funds can invest, but maybe pension funds can't, for example, or it's more complicated for them too. But there are more ways to do it. I think if somebody wants to and they call a broker or something or ask, there are more ways now than there were.
Sure. More generally, you've probably been asked this 1,000 times, and maybe it's an irrelevant question in the context of all the craziness around the world. But Adam, is the halving? Do you call it halving, halvening quantities?
I like the halvening, but I think it's interesting because I've chatted with people who have Bitcoin positions, even like relatively large ones, who don't know much about the mechanics. Like, when does it halve?
Yeah.
Why would that make a difference to price?
Yeah, I didn't finish my question, but that was my question.
Oh.
Is it priced in? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems like empirically, like just from talking to a few people, that a lot of people don't know about it, surprisingly, even people who are Bitcoin invested or don't know what it is exactly. So I thought the quantitative hardening is an interesting way to say it, because it's saying that the rate of supply of money is going down. And so even though a lot of people don't understand, fiscal policy and monetary economics and so on, they've heard that quantitative easing is a bad thing and creates inflation. So if you say Bitcoin is doing the opposite, that's probably a good thing, right? So at the same point, the world is losing its mind and printing ridiculous amounts of money, quantitative easing infinity, they call it.
Brr.
And coincidentally, Bitcoin is, in about a month now, going to do the opposite and half the rate of supply and undergo quantitative halving version 3, the third one. It's pretty interesting. And maybe that means something to a wider set of people, or at least they can understand that it's the opposite of quantitative easing.
All right, my last question, because I think we're pushing an hour by now. Have you been paying attention to the Bcash BSV halvenings? What do you think is going to happen there?
Not really. I guess what happened? BCH hash rate dropped a lot, or something, like more than people might have expected.
I think
Maybe
so.
some people were gaming the difficulty adjustment, like it's gyrating or something. I don't know. I mean,
apparently it now costs about 1 Bitcoin to double spend Bitcoin Cash, 51% Bitcoin Cash for an hour.
Yeah, that's pretty low. I mean, maybe they should consider merge mining or something. It's generally known that altcoins that, like low hash rate altcoins or low market cap altcoins that share a hash function with another bigger coin, have this problem that people can step in and chase the difficulty way up and then walk away and leave it without blocks for weeks. And that's where this difficulty adjustment algorithm comes to make that more dynamic. But it seems like they got the tuning on it wrong. There's not obvious things to mess with. And Bitcoin Cash particularly has another problem, which is they put a 10-block rolling checkpoint. So it would, I think, be pretty easy for somebody who paid the $7,000 or so to 51% attack it for an hour to actually fork the network, because some people will be on the wrong side of the 10-block rolling checkpoint, and then there'll be 2 Bitcoin caches, and if different exchanges are on different parts of it, then you have an accounting mess. So it's just I think that the proof of work consensus process is a singleton data structure. So for a given hash function that has ASICs, I think you kind of need ASICs these days, because if it's GPUable, people can game and switch functions, right? Then it's only really secure for one coin. I think sharing the proof of work is not a good thing for the smaller coin.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, so to sum it up, I think they have 3 problems. One is you can perform a regular double spend very cheaply, just spend the same coins twice. And then the second problem is it's relatively easy to drive the hash rate up very high and to stall the chain. Now they do have this dynamic block adjustment, difficulty adjustment algorithm.
Right.
But if it's high enough, you still need to find blocks for that to kick in. So if you drive it up high enough, then maybe there's not going to be a block for a long time anyways. I think that happens right after.
I think that's what the people are doing to it, if I understand, is they are not mining any blocks, letting the difficulty fall, and then mining blocks at a ridiculously fast rate to kind of strip mine it. And so this is kind of the second or third algorithm change they did around this historically. So I think there's some things wrong with it, but ultimately it's not really a sustainable thing to share a hash rate like that. I mean, to share a hash function.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental problem.
And then so the third problem, like you mentioned, is that you can split the chain indefinitely if you mine 10 blocks on each side.
Right.
So lots of interesting stuff to look forward to.
Yep.
Bitcoin halvening, economic collapse, maybe inflation, whatever it's going to look like, and the Bitcoin Cash, BSV.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's, in a way, the cryptocurrency ecosystem is a bit insulated from the physical economy. So, I think we should be thankful that that's the case, because, people doing Bitcoin mining are going to keep mining. The exchange's volume is up. I think a number of exchanges had their highest volume period ever in the history of Bitcoin last month, things like
Really?
that. So yeah, so I mean, metrics are good
Hmm.
for Bitcoin related businesses. Of course, the probably the funding is a little uncertain as VCs figure out how they're going to react to the economic environment. But I think traditionally, when the public markets are in turmoil, people look more to the private markets, i.e., venture funds and hedge funds and things, rather than public market, because they can invest for a longer period of time and pick growth things, whereas the public markets is passively investing basically. So that I think that might come back later in the year. The other thing is, there's the question about recovery. When does the physical economy resume? And I suspect it will resume sooner than a lot of people are thinking, because it plus or minus has to, which is to say that if you look at it on a global scale, if the economic situation goes global and gets worse, people are going to die for different reasons, which is half of the world's population is below the poverty line, and they can't afford to not get paid or they won't eat. So, I hope the Western policymakers think about that. I mean, it tends to be a bit of every man for himself thinking between countries, blocking export of medical equipment and things. But, ultimately the same thing applies inside countries too. So, economics and health and well-being are interrelated. So I would think that after we finally get some better testing and better data, so we know what's going on, and we get better evaluation of treatment plans and available drug programs to mitigate. Of course, a vaccine is a slower thing, but maybe even already within that, there is room to do more intelligent things and resume some of the economy. So, for example, the partial quarantine for people who are age-related or medically related at enhanced risk, that makes more sense than a kind of global, countrywide curtailment of economic activity.
Yeah. Well,
So
the other thing
yeah.
they're mentioning is in the Netherlands, at least in many countries now, and I guess I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well, is to use technology like GPS tracking to digitalize contact tracing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I was talking to some former colleagues who are sort of in the venture capital and company sort of founder kind of people about contact tracing, just on the cryptography side of it, because they knew I was somebody that would have some views on that. And I think there is some interesting things you could do, because the privacy impact is the obvious problem, right? But with Bluetooth devices, you could have proximity recording on a local device, and of course the Bluetooth has a MAC address too, so that tends to link. But much of the hardware allows you to tumble that, to change the MAC in software. So if you just keep changing the MAC, keep flicking the Bluetooth on, and writing down in local storage keys, and then when you do get to an online location, you share some encrypted data with a server, you should be able to, do reactive contact tracing or notify people that you're in contact with information. Of course, you can't have false information, like people just saying they're sick when they're not, just to, have a distasteful prank to alarm people. So you need like certificates of medical authorities, and of course that infrastructure is not present. So that's probably the bigger problem. But I think the basic infrastructure to do contact tracing is buildable.
Well, the other big problem is that it would only work if a lot of people use it. Ideally, everyone.
Right.
So because this is the technology they're discussing and considering in the Netherlands, which you just described, but they haven't decided whether they'll make it mandatory or not. What's your thoughts on mandatory or not?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't like mandatory things. I mean, the other context to bear in mind, and of course, if it's not mandatory, then probably a lot of people just won't get around to it. Or I don't think it'd even be philosophical if it's privacy related. It's just like, there's a lot of unprogrammed technology because people don't know how to install apps, right? But the other context is all of the GSM phones are tracked to a few meters, and your location is permanently logged in most countries. They're not talking about it, but they are permanently logging it. So
Already.
de facto, they have this information. Actually, as long as you're in GSM coverage, I mean, the point about the Bluetooth is that you could do it outside of GSM coverage, and with more kind of privacy. But there's a second triangulated data set, which is the GSM location data, which has got GPS coordinates. Well, it's not GPS coordinates, but it infers GPS coordinates from cell tower triangulation to quite high resolution. So I don't know if countries are using that, but it's data they have, and they seem to be, panicked to
They're definitely
bypass.
using it in Italy and in Israel.
Yeah, right. So I mean, the danger is that that kind of thing gets mission creep and used for other things, or doesn't go away afterwards. Now, of course, they're already recording the mobile data. So the question is, can the bypass of the regulations be removed afterwards?
Yeah. All right. Let's make an end to this podcast. Is there anything else you'd like to mention before we sign off? Something you'd like to shill?
Sure. I don't know. Like try out Liquid, install Liquid. If Bitcoin goes into another trading craze around the halving, people will be complaining about the fees. Most of the fee market excesses come from price insensitive traders. If you go onto an exchange and it has Liquid support, you can transfer between Liquid exchanges without incurring that fee and delay. So
Yeah,
try it out.
The green wallet also supports it, right?
Right. Yeah.
All right, Adam. Thanks a lot. I thought this was interesting. Have a good night. Have a good evening, and stay safe.
Thanks. Good chatting.
Thanks
Bye.
for being on. Cheers.